My name is Francisco Wright, 67 years old and widower to Eleanor, who left behind a $55 million estate when cancer took her last year. After the funeral, my son James cornered me in our home of 30 years. His words cut deep. "Dad, don't expect a dime from Mom's estate." His wife Patricia smirked beside him, adding, "We're in charge now." They forced me into a tiny apartment across town. But at the will reading, when Thomas the lawyer read the first line, I watched their faces drain of color completely. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment letting me know where you're from, hit that subscribe button, and prepare yourself for a story about greed, betrayal, and justice. I met Eleanor Blackwood at an art gallery opening in downtown Boston 4 decades ago. I was a high school literature teacher attending with my students, and she was there representing her family's charitable foundation. Eleanor wasn't just beautiful. She had this gentle confidence that drew me to her immediately. We connected over our shared love of classic literature and contemporary art, talking until the gallery staff politely informed us they were closing. Eleanor came from significant wealth. The Blackwoods owned a prestigious hotel chain that stretched across the East Coast, with properties in every major city from Maine to Florida. When I learned about her background on our 3rd date, I nearly walked away. A simple teacher with student loans still to pay off had no business courting an heiress. But Eleanor wouldn't hear of it. "My family's money has nothing to do with how I feel about you," she insisted. Her parents, especially her father, Harold Blackwood, strongly opposed our relationship. Harold was a 3rd-generation businessman who expected his only daughter to marry within their social circle, preferably to the son of another hotel magnate or a banking executive. When Eleanor announced our engagement after 18 months of dating, Harold threatened to disinherit her. Her mother Vivian was slightly more diplomatic but equally disapproving. Despite their objections, we married in a small ceremony with just my parents and a handful of friends present. None of the Blackwoods attended. Eleanor was cut off financially for about 2 years, during which we lived modestly on my teaching salary in a 1-bedroom apartment in Cambridge. She never complained once, taking a job as an event coordinator at a local university and bringing home day-old pastries from the cafeteria as treats. Harold's stance softened after his first heart attack. Facing mortality has a way of clarifying priorities. He reached out to Eleanor, and though the reconciliation was tentative at first, it eventually led to her rejoining the family business. Eleanor had inherited her father's business acumen, along with his stubborn streak. She started in marketing but quickly demonstrated a talent for property acquisition and development. Our son James was born 7 years into our marriage. Eleanor took just 6 weeks of maternity leave before returning to work, with us employing a nanny to help during business hours. I adjusted my teaching schedule to be home when possible, and we made sure one of us was always there for bedtime stories and weekend adventures. James grew up with privileges I never had as a child, but we worked hard to keep him grounded. He attended public school until high school, then a prestigious private academy, when Eleanor's parents offered to cover the tuition as a peace offering. James was bright, athletic, and generally well-liked, though I sometimes worried about the sense of entitlement that occasionally surfaced despite our best efforts. By the time James left for college at Princeton, Eleanor had taken over as CEO of Blackwood Hotels following her father's retirement. Under her leadership, the company expanded internationally, opening locations in London, Paris, and Tokyo. She also diversified the family portfolio, investing in tech startups, sustainable energy companies, and real estate developments. When James brought home Patricia Anderson during his junior year, we were delighted. She was studying business administration and seemed ambitious and intelligent. The daughter of a mid-level corporate executive, Patricia charmed us with her knowledge of the hotel industry and apparent admiration for Eleanor's business achievements. The wedding 2 years after their graduation was an elaborate affair, with hundreds of guests and coverage in several society magazines. Looking back, the changes in James began subtly after the wedding. Phone calls home became less frequent. Visits often centered around business discussions with Eleanor rather than family time. Patricia began referring to Blackwood Hotels as the family business and showing intense interest in Eleanor's investment decisions. By our 35th wedding anniversary, Eleanor's business empire had grown to include 15 luxury hotels, substantial minority stakes in 3 tech companies that had gone public, a renewable energy firm, and extensive real estate holdings, including our main residence in Beacon Hill, a beach house on Cape Cod, and a mountain lodge in Vermont. The total value of her assets had reached approximately $55 million, not counting the sentimental items like her mother's jewelry collection or the art we had acquired together over the years. Throughout our marriage, Eleanor and I maintained a unique balance. The money was technically hers, but all major decisions were made together. I continued teaching because I loved it, not because we needed my salary. I never felt lesser for not contributing equally financially, because Eleanor valued my support, perspective, and the stability I brought to our family. We were true partners in every sense. The diagnosis came on an ordinary Tuesday. Eleanor had been experiencing persistent fatigue and unexplained weight loss for several months. After numerous tests and specialist consultations, the oncologist delivered the devastating news: pancreatic cancer, stage 4, already metastasized to her liver. The prognosis was grim: 6 to 12 months with aggressive treatment. Eleanor, ever practical, listened to the doctor's explanation with remarkable composure while I struggled to breathe beside her. On the drive home, she reached for my hand across the console. "I'm not afraid of dying, Francisco," she said softly. "I'm afraid of leaving you." I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. We agreed to tell James and Patricia in person that weekend, requesting they come to the house for dinner without revealing why. The news hit James hard. He excused himself from the table and spent nearly an hour alone in his old bedroom before rejoining us. Patricia, however, shifted quickly from shocked sympathy to practical questions about treatment options, medical power of attorney, and getting affairs in order. At the time, I attributed her response to different coping mechanisms. Now, I recognize it as the first sign of the changes to come. Within 2 weeks, James and Patricia began visiting daily, often arriving while I was out picking up Eleanor's medications or groceries. Eleanor mentioned they were helping with paperwork, but changed the subject when I asked for details. Patricia started accompanying Eleanor to her oncologist appointments, insisting that I should conserve my energy for Eleanor's care at home. One evening, I overheard Patricia in the study with Eleanor. "You shouldn't worry about all these financial details now," she was saying. "James and I can take over managing things to reduce your burden. You need to focus on getting better." When I entered the room, Patricia quickly switched to discussing a new restaurant she wanted to try, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Eleanor began chemotherapy, a brutal regimen that left her nauseous, exhausted, and in pain. I rarely left her side, sleeping in a chair beside our bed on her worst nights. During one of her more lucid moments between treatments, Eleanor squeezed my hand and whispered, "I don't trust Patricia with the business, Francisco. Something feels wrong." I shared her concerns. James had begun referring to Eleanor's assets as the inheritance in casual conversation. Patricia had been photographing artwork and antiques in our home, claiming she was documenting for insurance purposes. They questioned Eleanor about investment account passwords and safe deposit box locations during her most vulnerable moments, just after treatments when she was barely able to keep her eyes open. 3 months after the diagnosis, Eleanor asked me to help her to the study when James and Patricia were out. With trembling hands, she dialed Thomas Wright, her personal attorney, and an old family friend who had handled the Blackwood legal affairs for decades. "I need to see you privately," she told him. "It's about my will." She scheduled the appointment for early morning, when she typically felt strongest, and asked me to create a diversion to ensure James and Patricia wouldn't accompany us. Eleanor's health deteriorated more rapidly than expected. The cancer was aggressive, and the chemotherapy seemed to drain what little strength she had without slowing the disease. James and Patricia began staying overnight in our guest room to help, though their help mainly consisted of intercepting visitors, screening phone calls, and having hushed conversations that abruptly ended when I entered the room. Patricia installed a scheduling app on my phone for Eleanor's care and visitors, ostensibly to keep things organized. In reality, it allowed them to control who saw Eleanor and when. Old friends of ours mysteriously had their visits canceled. Eleanor's assistant of 15 years, Margaret, was suddenly barred from the house due to infection concerns, despite her meticulous adherence to all medical precautions. 5 months into her illness, Eleanor managed to meet with Thomas twice more, each time under the guise of doctor appointments that I helped arrange, without James and Patricia's knowledge. After the final meeting, Eleanor seemed both exhausted and relieved. "I've done what I can to protect you," she told me that night, her once vibrant voice now barely a whisper. "Promise me you'll stand your ground when the time comes." I promised, though I didn't fully understand what she meant until later. During those final months, I watched helplessly as James and Patricia established themselves as gatekeepers between Eleanor and the outside world, including me. They controlled her medication schedule, decided which doctor's advice we would follow, and even began speaking for her during lucid moments. My protests were dismissed as the overwrought reactions of a grieving husband, unable to accept reality. When I insisted on privacy with my wife, they made me feel selfish for depriving her of family support. As Eleanor slipped away, so did my place in my own home. I became a guest, then an inconvenience, and finally an obstacle in their eyes. The woman I had loved for nearly 40 years was leaving me, and simultaneously, the son we had raised together was becoming someone I barely recognized. Eleanor passed away on a rainy Sunday morning in October. I was holding her hand, whispering our favorite poetry verses while James and Patricia stood at the foot of the bed. Her final conscious moment had been the previous evening when she had briefly opened her eyes, found my face, and smiled. The 8-month battle had ravaged her body, but in that moment, I saw my Eleanor again, just for a second, before she slipped back into unconsciousness. The funeral was an elaborate affair that felt nothing like what Eleanor would have wanted. James and Patricia overruled my suggestions for a small, intimate service and instead organized a grand event at the city's largest cathedral. Business associates Eleanor had met once received prime seating, while my brother and his family were relegated to the back rows. Patricia selected all black floral arrangements, despite Eleanor's lifelong love of wildflowers and bright colors. The eulogy, delivered by the CEO of a competing hotel chain rather than me, focused almost exclusively on Eleanor's business accomplishments, with barely a mention of her kindness, generosity, or our life together. Throughout the service, I sat in the front row, alone in my grief, despite being surrounded by hundreds of people. James and Patricia worked the room like politicians, accepting condolences and making connections. Several times, Patricia redirected people who approached me, steering them toward James instead. When Eleanor's cousin Susan tried to sit beside me, Patricia quickly intercepted her, claiming the seat was reserved for family. The reception afterward was held at our home, though it had already ceased to feel like mine. James had hired staff I didn't recognize, who politely but firmly directed me away from certain rooms where private business discussions were taking place. Longtime friends attempted to reach me, but were blocked by the subtle human barrier James and Patricia had created. By evening, exhausted and heartbroken, I retreated to our bedroom, only to find Patricia's mother using it to freshen up, my personal items already moved to a guest room. 3 days after burying my wife, James requested a family meeting in Eleanor's study. I arrived to find not only James and Patricia, but also their lawyer, a sharp-featured man named Victor Shelby, whom I had never met before. "Dad," James began without preamble, "we need to discuss living arrangements going forward." Before I could respond, Patricia interjected, "This house is simply too large for one person. The maintenance costs alone are prohibitive." "This has been my home for 30 years, I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. Eleanor and I chose every piece of furniture together, planted every tree in the garden. James shuffled some papers on the desk, Eleanor's desk. "Sentimentality aside, this property is part of the Blackwood portfolio. Mother may have indulged your living here, but legally speaking..." "Legally speaking what?" I demanded. "This is my home. Eleanor and I were married. We shared everything." Victor Shelby cleared his throat. "Mr. Wright, I understand this is a difficult time, but there were certain prenuptial agreements in place that limited your claim to Blackwood assets." This was the first I'd heard of any such document. Eleanor and I had married young, before her reconciliation with her parents. before the wealth had accumulated. There had been no prenuptial agreement. When I said as much, James smiled thinly. Grandfather insisted upon legal protections when Mother rejoined the family business. "You signed the papers, Dad. Perhaps you don't remember given how long ago it was." I knew I had signed no such thing. But before I could protest further, James delivered the blow I'll never forget. "Don't expect a dime from Mom's $55 million estate," he said coldly. "The Blackwood assets remain with Blackwood blood." Patricia, examining her manicure, added with a smirk, "We're in charge now. But don't worry, we've found a nice apartment for you. 1 bedroom, but quite adequate for a retired teacher." Within 2 weeks, I found myself living in a small apartment across town, surrounded by a few hastily packed boxes containing what James had deemed my personal effects. Family photos had mysteriously not made the cut. Neither had the first edition books Eleanor had gifted me over the years, nor the collection of vinyl records we had danced to in our kitchen. The isolation was immediate and calculated. Mutual friends stopped calling, later admitting that James had told them I wanted space to grieve. My pension covered the rent but little else, forcing me to take a part-time job at a local bookstore to afford groceries. Meanwhile, social media showed James and Patricia hosting parties at my home. Patricia wearing Eleanor's jewelry, James driving Eleanor's meticulously maintained vintage Jaguar. The nights were the worst. After 40 years of sharing a bed with Eleanor, the silence was deafening. I would wake reaching for her, only to find empty space. Some nights, I simply sat in the single armchair I had managed to bring from our home, staring at the wall until dawn broke. I lost 20 pounds in the first month, forgetting to eat or lacking the energy to prepare food. On what would have been our 41st anniversary, I received a small package via courier. Inside was Eleanor's dog-eared copy of Pablo Neruda's love sonnets, the one I had given her on our 5th anniversary. Tucked between the pages was a handwritten note in her elegant script, clearly written when her hands were steadier, before the worst of the illness. It read simply, "The truth persists even when we are gone. Trust Thomas. All my love. Always." It was the first moment since her death that I felt a spark of something other than grief. Eleanor had left me a message, a clue, a direction to follow. In the weeks following my discovery of Eleanor's note, I observed James and Patricia's behavior from afar, primarily through social media and occasional reports from Margaret, Eleanor's former assistant, who had reached out to me in secret. The picture that emerged was disturbing yet clarifying. James and Patricia had wasted no time claiming Eleanor's legacy as their own. They hosted lavish parties at our former home, with Patricia documenting everything on Instagram. Carrying on the Blackwood tradition, she captioned one photo of herself lounging by the pool, wearing Eleanor's distinctive sapphire necklace. James appeared in business publications, described as the heir to the Blackwood hotel empire, discussing expansion plans that Eleanor had specifically opposed during her final year. Their spending accelerated at an alarming rate. They purchased a vacation property in the Hamptons, a purchase Eleanor had always considered ostentatious. James ordered a custom sports car worth over $300,000. Patricia was photographed leaving exclusive boutiques carrying multiple shopping bags, later posting about her refreshed wardrobe worth tens of thousands. Most painfully, they began selling off items of deep personal significance. Margaret informed me that Eleanor's art collection was being quietly appraised for auction. The Japanese maple trees we had planted on each anniversary were removed to make space for a hot tub and outdoor kitchen. The baby grand piano where Eleanor had played Chopin on Sunday mornings was replaced with a pool table. Through it all, they never contacted me directly. I became a ghost in the narrative they constructed, erased from family photos that appeared in their social media posts, unmentioned in interviews James gave about continuing my mother's vision. 3 months after Eleanor's death, I received an unexpected phone call from Thomas Wright, Eleanor's attorney. His voice was cautious, almost cryptic. "Mr. Wright, I believe it's time we discussed certain matters pertaining to Eleanor's wishes. Would you be available to meet privately tomorrow? My office might be observed. Perhaps the Botanical Garden Cafe at 11. The meeting proved illuminating. Thomas revealed that Eleanor had indeed revised her will substantially during her illness, making the final changes just 6 weeks before her death. She was of completely sound mind, Thomas assured me. I had 2 independent physicians verify her cognitive capacity, knowing James might contest the will. Thomas also confirmed my suspicion that no prenuptial agreement existed. The document they referenced was a standard family business confidentiality agreement you signed when Eleanor rejoined Blackwood Hotels. It has no bearing on marital assets or inheritance. When I asked why Thomas hadn't conducted a will reading immediately following the funeral, as was customary, his expression darkened. James's attorney, Shelby, filed a series of legal maneuvers to delay the process, claiming they needed time to locate all relevant financial documents. In reality, they've been attempting to establish a case that Eleanor was unduly influenced during her illness. According to Thomas, James and Patricia had hired investigators to interview Eleanor's doctors, nurses, and even household staff, seeking evidence that I had somehow manipulated Eleanor while she was vulnerable. They were building a narrative that I had isolated Eleanor from her family during her final months, a cruel inversion of what had actually occurred. They've also been liquidating assets they don't technically have authority to touch, Thomas added grimly. I've been documenting everything. Eleanor anticipated this might happen. Through discreet inquiries, I discovered that James had been spreading rumors among family friends that I had been unfaithful during Eleanor's illness, explaining why she had supposedly cut me out of her will. The accusation was so outrageous I could barely process it. I had scarcely left Eleanor's side during her battle with cancer, certainly never for long enough to conduct an affair, even had I been so inclined, which I absolutely was not. With Thomas's guidance, I began meeting secretly with key allies. Margaret, the assistant who knew all the details of Eleanor's business affairs. Robert Chen, the financial controller who had worked with Eleanor for over a decade. And Diane Murray, Eleanor's closest friend since college. Each had stories of being sidelined or mistreated by James and Patricia, and each had information that would prove valuable. Margaret had copied key documents before being terminated, including emails between James and various auction houses dated months before Eleanor's death. Robert had maintained a separate record of all financial transactions, noting which ones lacked proper authorization. Diane had saved text messages from Eleanor expressing concerns about James and Patricia's intentions. 6 months after Eleanor's passing, just as I was gathering this evidence with Thomas's help, James made an unexpected overture. He invited me to lunch at an upscale restaurant downtown, arriving in Eleanor's Jaguar in what felt like a deliberate power move. "Dad," he said after ordering without consulting me, "I think we got off on the wrong foot after Mom's passing. Grief affects us all differently." I remained silent, waiting for the true purpose of this sudden reconciliation attempt. It soon emerged. James offered me a generous settlement in exchange for waiving all claims to Eleanor's estate. The offer, a small house in a retirement community 2 hours from the city, and a monthly stipend that amounted to little more than my current pension. "This way," James explained with practiced concern, "you won't have to work at that bookstore anymore. You can retire properly, as Mom would have wanted." When I didn't immediately accept, Patricia's name entered the conversation. "Patricia feels terrible about how things have gone," James claimed. "She's really struggling with managing all of Mom's business affairs while trying to start our family. This would bring peace to everyone." I thanked him for lunch and said I needed time to consider the offer. James looked satisfied, clearly interpreting my response as capitulation. As he dropped me off at my apartment, he mentioned casually, "The will reading is finally scheduled for next week. Just a formality, of course. Thomas Wright is such a stickler for procedure." Little did James know that Thomas, Margaret, Robert, Diane, and I had been preparing diligently for precisely this moment. The will reading was scheduled for 10 in the morning at Thomas Wright's law office in downtown Boston. I arrived 20 minutes early, parking my decade-old sedan next to Eleanor's Jaguar, now sporting a personalized license plate with James's initials. The juxtaposition was stark, not just 2 different cars, but 2 different worlds. Thomas's office occupied the entire 15th floor of a historic building overlooking Boston Common. The reception area was already filling with people when I entered. I recognized executives from Blackwood Hotels, longtime business associates of Eleanor's, several family friends, and even Harold's younger brother George, who had flown in from California. Several people nodded politely in my direction, but kept their distance. The unspoken message was clear. I was an outsider now, the former husband, rather than a continuing member of the Blackwood family circle. Only Diane Murray approached me directly, giving me a warm hug and whispering, "Eleanor would be disgusted by all this. Stay strong." James and Patricia made a grand entrance 10 minutes late. Patricia wore a black designer dress that I recognized as one Eleanor had purchased for a charity gala, but never worn. The price tag still attached when we found it in her closet. Around her neck gleamed Eleanor's grandmother's pearls, and on her wrist jangled the charm bracelet I had given Eleanor on our 20th anniversary, adding a charm each year since. James wore a bespoke suit and the gold cufflinks that had belonged to Harold Blackwood. They moved through the room with practiced charm, Patricia touching people's arms as she spoke to them, James offering firm handshakes and confident smiles. They acknowledged me with the briefest of nods before taking seats directly across from Thomas's desk, leaving me to sit in a chair near the back corner. At precisely 10 o'clock, Thomas entered carrying a leather portfolio. He was a tall, distinguished man in his mid-60s with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes. Eleanor had trusted him implicitly for decades, and seeing him stand before the assembled group, I understood why. He exuded quiet authority and unshakable integrity. "Thank you all for coming today," Thomas began. "We're here for the reading of the last will and testament of Eleanor Blackwood Wright. Before I begin, I must state for the record that this document was prepared and executed on September 14th of last year, when Mrs. Wright was of sound mind and body, witnessed by Dr. Sarah Jenkins and Dr. Michael Torres, both of whom have provided sworn affidavits to this effect." James shifted slightly in his seat, exchanging a glance with Patricia. They had clearly hoped to challenge the will's validity on medical grounds. Thomas opened the portfolio and adjusted his reading glasses. The room fell completely silent. I could hear the wall clock ticking, the faint traffic noise 15 stories below, the sound of my own heartbeat. I, Eleanor Blackwood Wright, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all previous wills and codicils, Thomas read formally. He paused, looked directly at James and Patricia, then continued with Eleanor's words. "I leave my entire estate, with the exceptions noted below, to the love of my life, my husband Francisco Wright, who has stood by my side for 40 years in authentic partnership, asking nothing, giving everything." The reaction was immediate. Patricia's mouth fell open in shock. James half rose from his chair, face flushing crimson. A murmur ran through the assembled group. Thomas continued reading, his voice steady. "To my husband Francisco, I leave 90% of my total assets, including but not limited to the Blackwood Hotel Group and all its properties, our primary residence at 74 Beacon Hill and all its contents, the Cape Cod Beach House and Vermont Mountain Lodge, all investment portfolios and bank accounts held in my name or jointly, my entire art collection, and all personal jewelry and belongings." Patricia's face had drained of all color. She clutched the pearls at her neck, so tightly I feared the strand might break. James was now fully standing, his expression a mask of disbelief and rage. "To my son James," Thomas continued, seemingly unperturbed by the reaction, "I leave 5% of my total assets, to be held in trust and distributed as monthly payments, contingent upon his demonstrated respect and care for his father, Francisco. Should James contest this will, or demonstrate continued disrespect toward Francisco, as determined by the trustee, this 5% shall revert to Francisco." James slammed his hand on the table. "This is outrageous. She was not in her right mind. We all know Dad manipulated her when she was drugged and dying." Thomas paused, looking at James over his glasses. "Mr. Blackwood Wright, please be seated. Outbursts will not be tolerated. As I stated, your mother's mental competence was documented by 2 independent physicians. Additionally, I have video recording of our meetings, which your mother explicitly requested as further evidence of her clarity and intentions. James remained standing, fists clenched at his sides, but fell silent. Continuing, Thomas said calmly, "To Patricia Anderson Wright, I leave my mother's cookbook collection and my sincere hope that she will find her own identity rather than attempting to appropriate mine." A few uncomfortable coughs sounded around the room. Patricia's face flushed with humiliation. "The remaining 5% of my estate is to be divided equally among the following charitable organizations," Thomas continued, listing several causes Eleanor had championed throughout her life, including educational scholarships for underprivileged youth and cancer research. Furthermore, Thomas read, "I appoint Thomas Wright as executor of my estate and trustee of all trusts established herein. He is empowered to withhold distributions to any beneficiary who contests this will or attempts to circumvent its intentions." The final section of the will contained a personal message. "To my dear Francisco, forgive James if you can. Remember that the greatest inheritance we leave is not measured in dollars, but in the love we've shared and the lives we've touched. You were always enough, exactly as you are." As Thomas concluded the reading, the room erupted in hushed conversations. James stormed out, Patricia hurrying after him, her high heels clicking aggressively on the hardwood floor. Several people approached me with congratulations or expressions of surprise, their previous reluctance to associate with me magically evaporating. Thomas met my eyes across the room and gave me a slight nod. Eleanor's voice echoed in my memory. "Promise me you'll stand your ground when the time comes." Now I understood exactly what she had meant. The weeks following the will reading unfolded like scenes from a courtroom drama, with James and Patricia mounting an aggressive legal challenge. They hired not one but 3 high-powered attorneys, each specializing in different aspects of estate law. Their primary claim: I had exercised undue influence over Eleanor during her illness, manipulating her into changing her will. Thomas Wright had anticipated this exact strategy. He presented the court with video recordings of Eleanor explaining her decisions clearly and articulately, the medical affidavits confirming her mental competence, and a detailed timeline of when James and Patricia had begun excluding me from Eleanor's care. Judge Harriet Simmons, a no-nonsense veteran of the probate court, reviewed the evidence with careful attention. While the legal battle proceeded, I began working with Thomas to understand the full scope of Eleanor's business empire. I had always supported Eleanor's career and understood the broad strokes of her work, but had never involved myself in the day-to-day operations. Now I found myself in board meetings, reviewing financial statements, and making decisions about properties I had previously only visited as Eleanor's husband. Margaret, reinstated as executive assistant, proved invaluable in this transition. She patiently explained complex business arrangements, introduced me to key personnel, and helped translate financial jargon into terms I could understand. Robert Chen, the financial controller, walked me through the company's accounts, identifying several irregular transactions James had initiated after Eleanor's death. The most illuminating discovery came when Thomas provided me access to Eleanor's private office safe. Inside, I found a USB drive containing a video diary Eleanor had maintained during her illness. Watching these recordings was emotionally wrenching but revealed crucial information. Eleanor had documented multiple instances of James and Patricia attempting to isolate her from me, pressure her about financial matters, and even remove papers from her desk when they thought she was sleeping. Most damning was Eleanor's account of discovering Patricia photographing financial documents and sending them to an unknown email address. When confronted, Patricia had claimed she was just trying to organize things but had become defensive and left abruptly. Eleanor had then asked Margaret to monitor access to sensitive information and had changed several passwords. Armed with this evidence, Thomas filed a countersuit against James and Patricia for attempted fraud and financial exploitation of an infirm adult. The business community that had initially embraced James as Eleanor's successor quickly distanced themselves. Several board members contacted me privately to express their support and share concerns about proposals James had been floating before the will reading, including selling off the original Blackwood Hotel properties to fund expansion into more glamorous markets. Patricia's facade cracked under the mounting pressure. 6 months into the legal battle, she was photographed by paparazzi in a screaming match with James outside their attorney's office. 2 weeks later, she filed for divorce, claiming James had become obsessive and unstable in his quest to overturn the will. In her divorce filing, which quickly leaked to the press, Patricia inadvertently confirmed many of our allegations, describing how James had been preparing to take control of his mother's assets for years before Eleanor's diagnosis. The court proceedings dragged on for 11 months in total. During one particularly tense hearing, James accused me directly of having married Eleanor for her money, despite the fact that she had been disinherited when we wed, and we had lived modestly for years before her reconciliation with her parents. "If you married Mom for love, why are you fighting so hard for her money now?" James demanded across the courtroom. "I'm honoring her wishes," I replied simply. "Something you might consider doing as well." The turning point came when Judge Simmons ordered an independent forensic accountant to review all financial activities related to Eleanor's estate from the time of her diagnosis forward. The report revealed that James had begun liquidating assets and transferring funds to offshore accounts within days of Eleanor's death, well before any legal authority had been established. Furthermore, emails recovered from James's business account showed him discussing plans to sell the Cape Cod property with a real estate agent 3 months before Eleanor passed away. Judge Simmons issued her ruling on a rainy Tuesday, almost exactly 1 year after Eleanor's death. The will was upheld in its entirety. Furthermore, due to James's attempt to contest the will, his 5% inheritance reverted to me, as per Eleanor's stipulations. The judge also referred the case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges related to financial exploitation, though those were later dropped when I declined to pursue them. Patricia's divorce from James was finalized shortly thereafter. She received a modest settlement that barely covered her legal fees and moved to Florida to work for her father's insurance company. James, now alone and facing financial ruin, disappeared from public view. According to Diane, who maintained connections with mutual friends, he sold his sports car and moved into a small condo in a suburban development, taking a mid-level management position with a hotel chain competing with Blackwood. Throughout this tumultuous year, I had been living in the small apartment, reluctant to return to the Beacon Hill house filled with memories of Eleanor and now tainted by James and Patricia's brief occupation. After the court ruling, I finally visited the property, accompanied by Margaret and Diane for moral support. The house had been transformed during James and Patricia's tenure. Eleanor's carefully curated decor had been replaced with ostentatious modern pieces. Family photos had been removed, walls repainted in cold, trendy colors. The garden Eleanor had lovingly tended for decades had been largely paved over for additional parking space. As I walked through this unrecognizable version of my former home, I found myself in Eleanor's study, the one room that seemed relatively untouched. Sitting at her desk, I noticed a loose panel in the bottom drawer, something only Eleanor and I had known about. Inside was a small leather-bound journal I had never seen before. The journal contained Eleanor's private thoughts during her final months, a record of her fears, hopes, and observations. Many entries concerned James and Patricia's behavior, documented with the same sharp insight that had made Eleanor such a successful businesswoman. But there were also numerous passages about me, about our life together, and about her hopes for my future after she was gone. The final entry, dated just 3 days before she lost consciousness for the last time, read, "Francisco will be devastated by what James and Patricia have become. My greatest hope is that somehow, someday, our son finds his way back to the values we raised him with. Francisco has the strength to withstand the storm coming, and the compassion to offer forgiveness when it passes. That has always been his gift." 2 days after discovering the journal, I received an unexpected visitor at my apartment. James stood at my door, unshaven, wearing jeans and a wrinkled button-down shirt instead of his usual tailored suit. He looked older, diminished. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice lacking its recent arrogance. I invited him into my small living room, offering coffee which he declined. "I've lost everything," he said after an uncomfortable silence. Patricia, my reputation, my friends. She's already dating some yacht broker in Miami. I'm sorry about Patricia, I said, meaning it despite everything. James looked up, surprised. After what we did to you? You're sorry? A broken marriage is always sad. Regardless of circumstances, he studied me for a long moment. How are you not more angry? We threw you out of your home. We told everyone you took advantage of Mom. We treated you like garbage. I was angry, I admitted. Some days I still am, but anger is exhausting, James, and it doesn't bring your mother back. I really thought, he began, then stopped himself. You thought what? That you married Mom for her money, that you'd been waiting all these years to cash in. He looked down at his hands. It's what Patricia kept saying, and eventually I believed it. Your mother and I were married 7 years before she reconciled with your grandfather, I reminded him. We lived in a 1-bedroom apartment on my teaching salary. If I was playing the long game for money, I was remarkably patient. The ghost of a smile crossed his face, then faded. I don't know how to fix this, Dad. I didn't have an answer for him that day. Some damage can't be undone with a single conversation or apology, but it was a beginning. 2 years have passed since Eleanor left this world. The legal battles are long concluded. The business stabilized under new management, and I finally found a measure of peace that once seemed impossible. After much consideration, I sold the Beacon Hill house. Even restored to its former state, it held too many complicated memories. Instead, I purchased a comfortable brownstone near my old school, with a garden where I grow the wildflowers Eleanor loved. The Cape Cod beach house remains as it was during our happiest summers there, a place where I can still feel Eleanor's presence in the sound of waves and the quality of light. Following Eleanor's example of thoughtful philanthropy, I established the Eleanor Blackwood Wright Foundation, dedicated to 2 causes close to her heart: supporting arts education in public schools and funding pancreatic cancer research. The foundation awards 20 full scholarships annually to promising students from disadvantaged backgrounds who want to pursue teaching careers, remembering how Eleanor always valued my contribution to education despite its modest financial rewards. The Blackwood Hotel Group continues its operations, now with a renewed commitment to the values Eleanor championed: ethical business practices, employee well-being, and community involvement. I serve as chairman of the board but leave daily operations to experienced executives, including Margaret, who was promoted to chief operations officer. My personal healing journey has been gradual and sometimes painful. In the months after Eleanor's death, consumed by grief and the subsequent betrayal, I had isolated myself almost completely. Diane eventually convinced me to join a support group for widowers, where I found unexpected comfort in sharing experiences with others who understood the peculiar emptiness of losing a life partner. The bookstore, where I had taken a part-time job out of financial necessity, became another source of healing. I continued working there even after the financial need disappeared, finding purpose in connecting readers with books that might change their lives, just as literature had enriched mine and Eleanor's relationship from the very beginning. James's path back has been complicated. Our relationship remains fragile, a work in progress. After our initial conversation in my apartment, weeks passed before I heard from him again. Then he began sending brief texts, an article about a book he thought I'd enjoy, a question about a memory from his childhood, small openings that required no immediate forgiveness or grand reconciliation. 6 months ago, James accepted a position with the Eleanor Blackwood Wright Foundation, working in a junior role managing university partnerships for the scholarship program. He lives modestly now, drives a used car, and has slowly begun rebuilding relationships with family friends who had distanced themselves during the legal battles. Patricia remains in Florida, remarried to a real estate developer, with no contact with either of us. Last month, James and I spent a weekend at the Cape Cod house, the first time we had been there together since before Eleanor's illness. One evening, walking along the beach at sunset, James asked the question that had clearly been troubling him. Do you think Mom would have forgiven me? I considered this carefully before answering. Your mother was many things: brilliant, determined, occasionally stubborn, but above all, she was compassionate. She believed people could change, could learn from their mistakes. That's why she structured her will the way she did, not just to protect me, but to leave you a path back. I didn't deserve a path back, he said quietly. Forgiveness isn't about deserving, James. It's about freeing yourself as much as the other person. This is perhaps the deepest lesson I've learned through this painful journey. Wealth can reveal character, but it doesn't have to define it. Money applied pressure to existing cracks in our family, widening them into chasms. But money has also provided tools for healing, creating educational opportunities for deserving students, advancing medical research, rebuilding what was broken. Eleanor understood this duality. Her will wasn't an act of revenge against our son, but a mirror forcing him to see what he had become. She knew that losing everything might be his only chance at regaining himself. In this, as in so many things, her wisdom surpassed my own. I still miss Eleanor every day. I miss her laugh, her sharp insights, the way she always coiled her warm feet under mine in bed. I miss planning trips we'll never take, and celebrating anniversaries that will never come. But I've found that grief, like love, evolves rather than diminishes. It becomes part of you, informing how you move through the world rather than stopping your movement altogether. If my story offers any wisdom, perhaps it's this. The true value of a life isn't measured in dollars or properties, but in the love we give freely, the integrity we maintain under pressure, and our capacity for both justice and mercy when wronged. Eleanor knew this. She lived it, and in her final act of love, she ensured that both her husband and her son would have the opportunity to learn it too. So what about you? Have you ever experienced betrayal from someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Did you choose bitterness or healing? Share your story in the comments below. If this resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to hear more stories of life's difficult lessons. Sometimes the hardest experiences yield the most valuable wisdom. Thank you for listening, and remember that even in your darkest moments, a path forward exists if you're brave enough to take it.